On the 1000th day of the Russia-Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin has changed the country's nuclear doctrine, and Ukraine has launched its first ATACMS long-range missiles into the country. So in this video, I reflect on 1,000 days of this conflict and what some of these latest developments could mean going forward.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going? Welcome to the channel. And if you're new here, well, this video is going to be slightly different in that it's largely unscripted. Normally, if I do a solo video explaining or analysing an event or events, I have, well, a script, and my inner perfectionist makes me re-record it 10, 20, 100 times, at least to the point where it's gotten dark again outside. This time, not so much, because I wanted to speak more candidly about what this day represents, reflect on 1,000 days of the war in Ukraine, as well as share a couple of major news developments. So if you're interested in a bit more of a personal aspect, then you can find that at the latter half of the video. Now, one of the first things I wanted to raise was actually about BlueSky. Interestingly enough, something I have observed in the time of being on the platform and social media more broadly is that many people who are anti-establishment or disenfranchised with the establishment as it is, the status quo, is that they often will, be them opportunists, grifters, or just pure liars, claim that they have been shadow banned, they have been censored and suppressed or outrightly demonetized, and that they need your help as independent supporters and creators to fund the truth. The irony now being that with the acquisition and changes of X by Elon Musk, a lot of people who may not agree 100% with his perspectives have been deplatformed or censored completely, shadow banned. And creators like myself or commentators, people who seek to simply provide more diversified set of opinions, are no longer to have any reach at all. We have been artificially constrained, and BlueSky is an alternative to this. Now, I'm not saying to leave X completely if you have it. This isn't a departure from X. It's an encouragement for diversification. I think having both platforms is important, particularly at a time when information is going to be significantly changed. And if you want to continue to support people who are here doing a good fight, then it's worth supporting them as well. So I encourage you to check out BlueSky. Follow me or other creators, many of whom we've had on the show before, and support what they're doing. It can often be very difficult for people who have built up an established platform to see it pulled from under their feet and them having to start again. This isn't about monetary support as such. It's more just about ensuring where you can continue to combat disinformation, propaganda, or just very, very blatant agendas. So you can follow me via the link on screen now or in the description below. And you'll also find recommendations in a starter pack and a couple more that I've made on the app. Next, and for the main proportion of the video, I wanted to touch upon some of the main developments of the 1000th day of the war in Ukraine, notably Putin's revised Russian nuclear doctrine and Ukraine's first use of long-range missiles into Russian territory. Now, I think it's worth pointing out some minor differences between Russian and US nuclear doctrine, because there are, and that can play into the calculus of each respective leader and government. Now, when it comes to overall strategy and purpose, both Russia and the US maintain nuclear doctrines centered on deterrence to prevent larger scale conflict. Now, Russia also emphasizes deterrence, though, including more conditions which nuclear weapons could be used, reflecting its sort of perceived threats from regional adversaries like NATO or Western alliances, versus the US, which places emphasis on nuclear weapons as last resort. Second is conditions for use. So whilst the US maintains a policy that nuclear weapons can only be used under, quote, extreme circumstances, the Russians have a more expansive interpretation, allowing for the use of nuclear weapons in response to significant conventional attacks that threaten the state's survival. This policy, sometimes described as a more flexible use strategy, indicates a readiness for nuclear use even in non-nuclear scenarios that Moscow deems will jeopardize core interests or sovereignty. When it comes to first use policy, the US maintains strategic ambiguity on first use, allowing it to retain the option of being the first to deploy under those undefined, quote, extreme conditions. Meanwhile, Russia retains ambiguity also, but it explicitly states and permits first use in scenarios involving those conventional threats that would escalate to existential risk, which is broader than the US definition. When it comes to tactical versus strategic emphasis as well, the US focuses heavily on strategic deterrence with robust ICBMs, some marine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bomber triads. Comparatively, Russia integrates tactical nukes a lot more into its military strategy. It's partially due to this conventional force emphasis that we've already raised, but also the concept of escalate to de-escalate, which you might have heard in the media, which suggests that Russia might use tactical nuclear weapons to control or end conflicts on favorable terms, and that they involve their calculus a lot more in regional and strategic calculations. Command and control. Russia's command and control centralizes command under the president, similar to that of the US. But the inclusion of the perimeter system under Russia is a unique aspect of Russian doctrine in that it ensures automatic retaliation if the leadership is incapacitated, compared to the more checks and balances or safeguards that the DoD might have and military commanders to prevent accidental or unauthorized use. Then, when it comes to like modernization efforts, the US has been undergoing somewhat modernization in its nuclear triad, be it like the Sentinel ICBM, the Columbian class submarines, or B-21 Raider upgraded bombers. This is different to Russia, who's been much more aggressive in its arsenal, deploying advanced systems like the Avangard hypersonic guide missile, Sama ICBM, and other high-tech capabilities that it is trying to ensure can penetrate US space if needed. And then the last is policy on no first use. Russia and the US do have similar desires to avoid a non-first use declaration, with Russia emphasizing potential first use as a way to deter both nuclear and non-nuclear existential threats. Keeping all of that in mind, what exactly is today changed? Well, Putin has signed an official decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response, as we've touched upon, to conventional attacks that it deems threatens its sovereignty. But it also includes drones, which Ukraine has used multiple times to target Russia, particularly even Moscow itself. Russia also has expanded to view aggression against itself or its allies by a non-nuclear state backed by a nuclear power as a joint attack. This follows a pledge that Putin made in September, something we did cover at the time around the intensified rhetoric, only for it to be drowned out by the events in the Middle East, which, if you're interested, are available on the channel, the videos at the time. Now, similar, you can argue, to how the US avoids calling China out regarding tensions over Taiwan, Moscow didn't explicitly state in its wording any country, but it's obvious who it refers to because there's only 3 countries that can support Ukraine and are nuclear capable. That would be the US, UK, and France. And when regarding allies, Russia did explicitly reference Belarus. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said, quote, "The Russian Federation retains the right to use nuclear weapons in the case of aggression using conventional weapons against it," and end quote, that poses critical threat to the sovereignty or territorial integrity. So what that means is a change in calculus, at least on paper, but it's difficult to fully ascertain in what might be the red line, the trigger point of what defines critical threat in the mind of Putin and the Kremlin. Indeed, as at the time of recording this video, the US had already released a statement stating that they had seen, quote, "no reason to change or adjust our own nuclear posture or doctrine in response to Russia's statements today," i.e. the US had noted the wording of this decree, but didn't deem it enough of a danger to adjust its own nuclear doctrine. Indeed, Putin has made constant references to red lines, but never really followed through. Many, including myself, for example, were worried about Ukraine striking into Russia at all in the earlier days of the war. But Moscow did nothing once Ukraine started using drones and such to make incremental strikes across the border. And indeed, when Ukraine conducted an actual ground incursion into Kursk, for the first time Russia's been invaded since the Second World War, Russia still hasn't responded in a way some people might have feared they would. But this is a notable development because of how much it telegraphs Moscow's position and intentions, much like you can argue Iran did when they were launching retaliation strikes to Israel earlier on in 2024. They were making very clear what they aim to do, and almost as a form of de-escalation, hoping that by being very clear, including the Iranians sending a communique via the UN, it would lead to a drawdown in tensions. So it will highly depend on what Ukraine, I think, chooses to do with these weapons. At the time of recording, Ukraine had admitted that it had deployed an ATACMS missile to strike a military facility in the western Bryansk region. The Russian Defense Ministry had also confirmed this, and it was a ammunition storage at a site around 115 kilometers from the border of Ukraine. But this is the main point I think, want to emphasize, which is think about it from the perspective of Putin or any political leader. No country or individual really wants to be the first to actually launch a nuclear weapon. Moscow, for example, has just hosted the BRICS, a very important illustration of Russia's continued incorporation and role on the international sphere, despite the West's attempts to say that it is politically isolated and a pariah state. Would Putin really want to jeopardize all that by launching a nuclear warhead in response to conventional strikes on military targets in Russia? Indeed, the reputational damage and precedents it would set are massive, and it wouldn't really be worth the fallout. For China, India, or any other country that is non-aligned or even more sympathetic to Russia, they would see such a choice by Moscow as reckless and really unnecessary to the overall international security and economic outlook. Indeed, China benefits from the economy as it is, and whilst it supports Russia benignly, or shall we say through benevolent neutrality, it still doesn't welcome the use of nuclear weapons and has been very firm on that. President Xi has been very firm with Putin on that. Indeed, once you make such a move, you can't reverse it, and the implications among the relations that Russia benefits from right now would be far outweigh any use of nuclear weapon usage, and they wouldn't determine the outcome of the war, at least on the line of contact as it stands. Anyway, I'm not pretending to know Putin's mindset, but aside from whether you think of him on what you think of him or not, he is a rational actor, an actor whose intended 3-day special military operation is actually on its 1000th as a war. But, I guess he's maybe not a master strategist, as some people like to pretend. When the war first started, the full-scale invasion first started, I was in Washington, D.C., and being so close to the center of US power, at least, it was very, the events were palpable. And I remember attending a few demonstrations within the first 3 to 4 days of the war breaking out in front of the White House, meeting so many Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians and other former Soviet Union states that were all protesting in unison against what had developed. I was very active on an app called Clubhouse, and we began hosting rooms in the run-up to the war, summarizing the major developments and just whether or not this was actually going to happen. And within 24 hours of the actual war beginning, we launched a 24-hour non-stop audio space. It became known as the Ukraine Sitrep Room. And the difference between, say, Twitter Spaces, if you're used to or familiar with social audio, is that it never stopped going. You didn't need to restart it. It never shut down. And over the first couple of weeks, we began to develop a team, develop a format. And within the first month of the war, it had become one of the go-to spaces for people, not only within Ukraine, but also Russia. Clubhouse usage actually went up by 600% because the Kremlin was not aware of Clubhouse as a social media app compared to some of the larger ones like Facebook, X, and so on. So we were actively engaging, communicating with people in real time who were based in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, but also in Kiev, in Lviv, in Odessa, in Kharkiv. We managed to help evacuate people from the country. We managed to raise many thousands of dollars and funds towards Ukrainian humanitarian and defense efforts. The first 100 days of the war, we managed to reach over 2 million listeners. Then one day, I began to reflect in the fact that I was living in Washington, D.C., and had been fortunate enough to go to a respected university known as Johns Hopkins and its School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, where I knew many informed people, experts, historians, scholars, that I thought could be of benefit to people who were listening. On average, we would have 5,000 to 6,000 people listening every hour, and at peak times, potentially as high as 10 to 20,000 live listeners. It was a very powerful experience. And I suddenly began to think, maybe we can utilize this further off app and also in more sort of evergreen ways. So I launched the Global Gambit, the show that you are watching and consuming right now. It began by hosting a few professors from my own university. Then it began to expand to journalists and other content creators, former politicians, and it grew into its own notable brand. So the war in its 1000th day has had an incredible amount of impact on so many people. So the war in Ukraine on its 1000th day has had incredible amounts of impact, no one more so than Ukrainians themselves. It has allowed me to engage with incredible people, be that those who support Ukraine directly, professionals who have lived in the country or work in international relations, economics, diplomacy, but also the discovery of new disciplines and things like open source intelligence, which have played a fundamental role in dispelling disinformation, pushing back against propaganda, and countering, well, crap. And so, as the war continues past its 1000th day, I just wanted to take a moment to say a big thank you to those of you who have been following me since day one, or February 2022, or those of you who've joined even just as this video has been published. I really appreciate all of you. And even if we don't fully agree, you differ with me on certain details, well, I welcome you. This is not an echo chamber, and I always look forward to debating over details. And also to all the creators, be them Ukrainian or people who support Ukraine. It's been an incredible journey, an opportunity to meet people who have inspiring stories and motivations to help others in grave times of need. I hope that we can move forward together to do so as well, and hopefully in better circumstances. But that's it from me, everyone. And as we say here on the Global Gambit, you either have to get playing or be played. Take care.